Well, welcome everybody. We're really excited to see all of you this evening. We have a great program. I'm Kathy Dodge. I'm the president of the Museum Foundation. And tonight we're going to have a program, as you know, on Cowboys and Their Ranches. So we're excited about it. Before we start, we're going to have a drawing at the end. We have been given some fair tickets. I think all of you probably were given a ticket to write your name on. Is that correct? And we're going to do a drawing at the end for entry for fair tickets for this year. And I want to thank Lori Giannini. Stand up, please, Lori, for doing this. Thanks a lot. Okay, at this time, I'm going to introduce Lee Croletto. Lee is the vice chairman of the Angels Camp Museum Commission, and she has a special announcement.
We welcome the Foundation and the Museum Commission and the City of Angels. We welcome you to our lecture series tonight. And it was with great pleasure that I would like to introduce our new Museum Director, Kimberly Arth. So, we're excited to have her. You'll learn a lot more about her at the next lecture series and something in the paper probably next week, as she'll be formally introduced by the City of Angels Camp at the next City Council meeting. But Kim has been here 6 days and counting as a full-time director. She comes to us with 6 years on her last job as a museum director and a master's in museum studies, and we're all excited to have her.
Okay, at this time we will start our program. Bob Petholm.
Welcome all of you, and I want to apologize for the seating. We've always had a little issue with chairs, and then the kind person came by about a year ago and donated a nice large sum of money, so we were able to buy all the chairs that you have here and a nice rack to store them on. We never anticipated such a large crowd. This is wonderful. And if there's anybody out there who would like to donate some more chairs, we could always use them. But I'd like to take now and introduce our speakers for this evening and thank Nancy Will. Nancy helped me put this list together, and I think we have an outstanding group here tonight. But we have Bill Arola, and he'll lead off today. Shauna Shockey, and Rex Whittle, and Rusty Roleri. So please give them a welcome. They're going to tell us a little bit about ranching and cowboying back in the circa 1850 area. So, thank you.
I want to thank you for inviting us to come here tonight and share some of our family history with you. I'm going to start a little bit earlier than when we actually started raising cattle, just to kind of set the scene. I'm going to go and start where there was a ship that came into the port of New York. It was called the Fortunato. This was in June 9th of 1849. The ship's manifesto lists an 11-year-old individual named Emmanuel Arola. Occupation, farmer. I guess in those days they can you hear me okay? In those days, I guess you had to pick an occupation pretty early, because that's pretty amazing. But anyhow, he came on the ship from Italy, and looking over the manifesto of names, we find names such as Lagomasino, Ratto, Solari, Perano, Cuneo, and others, just to mention a few. But the interesting thing that we found was that Manuel was by himself. And I'm not sure why there was such an influx. I don't believe it was the gold rush, but I believe there was some problems going on in Italy at the time, because there was a lot of young men listed on the manifesto. So I think there was some unrest in the area. A lot of the families were sending their young men away at the time. Anyhow, I'm not sure how Emmanuel got to the Mother Lode from New York, but we found him here on the 1860 census in Angels Camp at the age of 22, occupation gold miner. In August of 1883, or 1863, excuse me, he married Carolina Figueroa. He then purchased a store, saloon, and rooming house at Robinson Ferry down in Maloney's. They moved to a home nearby. Of this marriage was born Augustine Gus Arola, born in 1864, Anton Tony Arola, born in February of 1866, Giovanni, who liked to call himself Johnny Arola, born in 1868. Then there was a fourth child born. Yeah, it would, a little bit. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. Then there was a fourth child born. His name was Luigi. And when he was about 15 months old, him and Emmanuel came down with an illness. I probably think it was the flu or something. And he passed on on May 20th, and Emmanuel, his father, died 6 days later. They are both buried in Altaville together. Emmanuel was 36 at the time. During his illness, Emmanuel made out his final will in the last few days. This set up a trust fund for the three boys. Shortly after Emmanuel's death, the store, saloon, and house, along with various mining claims, were all sold. Then about 3 years later, Caroline remarried Bethalzer Riddell, and they moved to Carson Hill to a ranch. It was there that the cattle business started. Let's go ahead and next slide. Wait a minute, they're out of order. Can you go back? Back a little bit more. Back one more. This is Caroline and Emmanuel when they were married. Next slide. This is the saloon and the market down in Robinson Ferry. And here's their home. Okay. So after they moved to Carson Hill, this is when they started the cattle business. And this person right here is Gus Arola, and he was the oldest boy. Next slide. This is Anton, and this is John. They worked for a Frenchman called Jean Yaffo on the ranch between Robinson Ferry and Maloney's and Vallecito. It was there that they took care of the cattle, put up hay for winter feeding, took cattle to the high country, and back down in the fall. They were paid with cattle. These payment cows became the brood cows of the Arola herd. Next slide. Gus, the oldest, married Melinda Yoakum in 1885. Their first son, Manny Arola, was born in 1888. Manny became a legendary bronc buster, taking many championships in Stanislaus, Calaveras, Mariposa, and Tuolumne counties. Next slide. The youngest born to Gus was Marvin Raymond Arola, more commonly called Smokey Arola, and he was quite a baseball player. He was born in 1908, but he raised cattle on the Carson Hill Ranch in the lower Angels Creek area. Irrigation water came from Angels Creek, supplied via a ditch, provided summer grazing for Smokey's herd. He died in 1887, after which none of the Arolas carried on in Gus's line. I wrote notes on different pages here. Okay, we go to Antone. Antone was the next to marry. In 1887, he married Louisa Di Martini, the Frenchman who the Arola boys had worked for earlier. Returned to France in 1890, but not before he sold the ranch to the hardworking Antone. Antone and Louise raised their 4 children, Addie, Fred, Gladys, and Sidney, or Babe, as we called him, at the French Camp Ranch on the now Arola Road off Parrots Ferry Road. Let's go to the next slide. This is a picture of Babe Arola down on his ranch with his Hereford cattle. Fred and Babe helped their dad on the ranch. They would become prominent cattlemen themselves. Antone's summer pasture for the cattle was up at Cow Creek, or Bumblebee, in Tuolumne County. Next slide. Here it is. In 1924, an outbreak of foot and mouth disease occurred, and all the cattle had to be destroyed. Here you see them driving the cattle into natural rock corridors where they were shot and burned. Antone sent for more cattle. I believe he sent Mills, Mitchell, and Babe or Fred to go over to Nevada and replace the herd. Next slide. Oh, I guess we don't. I got ahead of myself there. Anyhow, Fred Arola acquired the Clark's Fork permit sometime in the 30s or 40s. My dad got it in, I think it was 53, and I took it over in 1998. That's up at in Tuolumne County, next to Alpine County, off of 108. Okay, here we have a picture of John Arola. He was the youngest of the boys. He married Emma Louise Yoakum in December of 1890. They met when they came to visit her sister Melinda, who was already married to John's older brother Gus. John and Emma started out on a 160-acre homestead, which is now the county fairgrounds. The Angels Race Track Association finally convinced John to sell in 1893. Earlier in 1889, John had purchased the Vasallo Ranch from Antone, so they moved there. The Vasallo Ranch is where I live currently. It's on Red Hill Road, and my dad built a home there in 1954, where we moved from town out to the Red Hill Ranch. Okay, next slide. It was here that my grandfather, Tone Arola, was born in December 12, 1893. His brother Virgil was born at the racetrack, or the fairgrounds property, in May of 1892. He went on to become the district attorney and then Superior Court judge in San Andreas. Tone stayed on the ranch and went into the cattle business with his dad. He started his herd by buying a cow that had 2 calves, a yearling and a newborn, from Mrs. Ramaji out on Highway 49. The Ramaji place that used to stick out in the road. It doesn't anymore, but anyhow, I'm sure many of you know where it's at. And this was the start of Tone's herd. Tone married, next one. Tone married Margaret Bessie Donovan in 1923. Through the years, Tone negotiated for ranch land around the area. He bought the Marshall Place, then the Cordes, then the Platcher, then the Miller Ranch. He wanted to put together a nice place to leave for his boys. Tone and Bessie built a new house in 1954 on the Hawkeye Ranch. It was an old stage stop between Altaville and Fourth Crossing. Part of the ranch is irrigated for cattle. Bob Arola lives there now. Let's have the next slide. I'm just going to go through some of the activities. This was an earlier shot of my grandfather, my dad on the other side, branding calves. It was probably in 1952 or thereabouts. Next one. Then, of course, there's always a picnic after a branding. You see Grandma Bessie sporting the nice hat on the left. And then my dad in the back. And my sister's in there. You can just barely see her, Ginger. And my mom, my grandpa, Bob Arola, myself sitting down there, and my brother is swinging there. Next one. This is part of the routine that we go through before we go to the mountains. It's you see the veterinarian on the right there. He's preg checking the cows, and if they're pregnant, they get a bell on and they get to go to the mountains. Next slide. Here's Jason Arola putting on a bell. Next one. Here we are in 05 at Groves, heading to McCormick Meadow, down on the lower part of the allotment. Next one. This is Grow Meadow. Just unloaded some cattle in 97. That was in I think the 3rd or 4th of May. It was pretty early in the year that year. Next one. This is the last cattle drive. This is right above Murphy's. Actually, we're coming down the hill. And you can see on the turn up there, the cattle are heading this way. And my grandfather's in the forefront here, and that's Bob Arola, holding them up because they always wanted to go like heck when they came home. And now is the modern day move where we have trucks, big trucks, semis. These happen to be truck and trailers. Then another shot of the coming home. This is a shot of my dad and mom in the early days, probably around 43 or 44, out at Frogtown, some competition out there. I like the duds he had on. This is my dad later on. And as you can see in this photo, this is all of us, the next generation. Lots of cowboy hats there, so hopefully it's going to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And Shauna, we'd like to have you come up next. And do you have slides, Shauna?
No.
I think we can turn the lights back on then. Thank you.
I didn't get as, we're going to have to lower it now. I'm going to stand on my tippy toes. Perfect. I didn't get slides and do a presentation, so I apologize. Just trying to put this together. Most of the family obviously had passed on before I was born. that I'm going to be talking about. But my name is Shauna Osborne Shockey, and I'm a sixth-generation Osborne, born and raised here in Calvert County. And I currently live on the family ranch with my family. And our great-great-great-grandfather, George Washington Osborne, came to California in the 1850s from, there's been questions of Arkansas and Tennessee, and they were miners when they arrived. One of George's sons, Samuel T. Osborne, homesteaded the present Osborne Ranch in 1872. At that time, the family still was continuing with mining. They had the Belmont Osborne mine and the Gold Hill Quartz mine, as well as ranching with cattle, Herefords, and then they started crossing Shorthorns at the time. Sam also was a freighter. He used to haul heavy loads from Milton to Silver City on the east side of Ebbets Pass. And he used to use a team of oxen first until he got his horses, and then he had a team of 15 to 20 horses he used to use to haul the heavy loads up and over the pass. There's an area known as Silvertip Campground near Lake Alpine on Highway 4, and there's a hill named Osborne Hill, and that was named after my great-great-grandpa Sam, because that's where he stopped on his overnight freighting trips. Sam was married twice. In his first wife, he married Mary Blackburn, and they had 4 children, and then she passed away in her 20s. Sam remarried to Sarah Halleck, and they had one other son. Elmer, who was my great-grandfather, was one of Sam's sons and was raised on the family ranch. Elmer married Mary Reister, who I believe that's where we tie in with the Whittles. It's hard to keep track of all that. They had 2 children, Reggie and Geraldine. Reggie helped my great-grandfather with the ranch. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats. Sam had incorporated the sheep and goats and many other activities along the way. The goats and the sheep helped keep the brush down for the cattle and gave them more room to graze. And they would sell the wool and the mohair, and they would sell the goats also for meat. Reggie was 16 years old when his father Elmer passed away, and he had to help start running the ranch. From what I've heard from everybody, Reggie was a great horseman and loved to break and train horses. He was involved in the Amateur Rodeo Cowboys Association and helped to put together the Calvert Saddle Club. Competed in different shows with halter and breaking. He also rode saddle bronc and calf roped in the rodeos. Grandpa Reggie married Beth Grexton, and they had 2 sons, Thomas Osborne and Robert Osborne. Robert was my father. Reggie continued raising cattle and goats and sheep on the ranch until the market wasn't worth raising the goats and sheep anymore, and they sold them off and kept the cattle. Reggie continued to ride in the rodeos until he severely broke his leg. He was in a cast for 3 years, several operations, and I believe at that point Grandma Beth told him no more rodeos. It was a really difficult time at the ranch. My dad and his brother were very small and couldn't help out to keep the ranch moving, so Grandpa had to do it with the help of Beth, and I believe other families came and helped too when they could. My mom remembers Reggie being in his cast and still, handling the chores, and the barn needed to be re-roofed, so he was tied off on one side and had his cast on and was still re-roofing on the other side. Reggie passed away on his horse in 1971 at the age of 53, and from what I understand, that was the best way to go for him. My grandma had to sell most of the cattle to cover the taxes when he died, so she could hang on to the ranch. My Uncle Tom bought some of the cattle and currently lives on the ranch along with his daughter's family. And our cousins, the Whittles, lease the ranch and currently run cattle there too. So the family's been here since the 1850s, was heavily involved with cattle and mining and lots and lots and lots of stuff. So thank you guys.
Thank you, Shauna. By the way, after the last speaker, we'll have a little time for questions and answers if anybody would like to ask some questions to these people. But Rex, would you like to come up next, please? Thank you.
Okay, thank you also for having all of our families here. It is quite an honor. I would like to say that, you know, there's a lot of ranching families around here that I guess we're sort of representing that tonight, but they've asked us to speak about the Whittles. And to start there, you kind of have to go back to England in about 1839 or 40 when a guy named Alexander and his wife Rachel and a little girl named Elizabeth, about 9 or 10 months old, got on a ship called the Brothers, and we found some records that said it was an assisted immigration. So maybe it wasn't what we always assumed it might be. But so we're kind of hoping it was just, they wanted people to colonize Australia, so that's where they went to. And the manifest states that they were on that ship over 6 months, probably went around the Horn of Africa, I guess, to get there. And it gave all sorts of information about what they ate, what they did. Alexander, he could read and write, and his wife, she could write. I think she could read, but she couldn't write. But anyway, so they arrived in Sydney, Australia, after being on that ship from September to March. So I think it was 1840 they got there. They lived there, and one of the first children that was born was our great-great-great-grandfather. His name was Joseph Whittle. He was born in 1843. Like I said, they had a daughter already, and then another couple of boys were born, and another daughter named Jane. And and he was a sawyer. They list him as a sawyer, and in the timber business, and also a publican, which we found out he had a pub, I guess. He was licensed to have a pub in the house. So it looks like maybe he left Australia ahead of his family, and she stayed back there to try to sell the pub or get some money. And then I guess they either followed, or maybe they all came, but they came to San Francisco in 1849 when my great-great-grandfather was 6 years old, Joseph Whittle. So, and they probably got off the ship and got into Stockton, maybe up on the port, and if you can imagine how they might have got up into this country, but they came to Tuolumne County. Sounds like over by Rawhide, by Tuttletown, and settled there. And the next thing we know is Alexander and his wife Rachel were no longer together, and we have a newspaper article out of it's like a Sacramento paper, it's called the Upper California paper, where Alexander Whittle was found on 6 Mile Creek out here outside of town with his throat cut from ear to ear and apparent suicide. That's what it listed. But his wife had left and went to San Francisco, and the article states that he drank and he was heavily drunk when this happened to him. And he's buried right out there in Smokey Rolla's field there at Carson Hill, right across from the mine. That's where Smokey showed me when I was younger where he's buried, and that's where it said he was. So then we find that he left his little boy, that was about 1851, so those kids weren't very old, but the son Joseph and his sisters kind of shows them to be around Tuttletown still, and it ends up that Joseph Whittle, he met and married an Irish girl on the Stanislaus River down there at Bostic's Bar on this side of the river. Her name was Mary Ann Quigg, she was born in New York, but they came from Ireland. And they moved up here in Angels, and they had a daughter, Elizabeth, in about 1869. And when Shauna said we're related, it's because Elizabeth would be your great-great-grandmother. She married a Reister eventually, and then Uncle Reggie's mother was her daughter. So, something like that. That's how we're related to the Osborns. So then they had a son named Joseph Whittle, and they had some daughters, Kate and Addie and Aunt Mamie, and another son, Harry Whittle. But Joseph Whittle, then the next Joseph Whittle was my dad's grandfather, and he was born about 1875. And Marianne, she had about 6 kids, and then she had a set of triplets. And the last ones, they were born in 1885, and out at the old ranch out here. And it said that it was quite an oddity that everybody came out there to see the babies and see the mother, and they didn't survive very long, just too much. And you can imagine they were probably premature or whatever, but they were all buried here in the Catholic cemetery. And right shortly thereafter, in 1886, the next year, Joseph Whittle, who was he was known for raising horses that pulled sulkies, and was quite well known in that way. But he also worked on the county roads, I think, and they said that he was lifting a heavy load out of some mud or something on a toll road here, and he died that year. So it left her with all those kids. I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit. Him and Marianne had bought the old ranch, which we still own out here. It's 160 acres, the Whittle Ranch. We call it the old ranch. They bought it from a guy named Isaac Nance, and it sounds like about $1,000, and then some unpaid taxes and stuff like that. When he died, it listed his assets as having 6 horses, 6 cows, a buggy, a wagon, a sulky, some chickens probably, and a mortar, a quart. I asked my dad what was the mortar. It was a little quartz mortar where they smashed up quartz to try to get, see how much gold was in it, and some household furnishings and that. But they also had the Whittle Mine, which is right out here on Whittle Road to the left if you're driving out. They call the White Oak Ranch now, where Janet Cousage is, and Calaveras Lumber, where they live right there, and the mine is there, which they said Joseph Whittle got enough money out of that mine to help him purchase that ranch. So but that isn't ours anymore. The Arola family ended up buying that, and then it's passed on from there. So we get to that Joseph Whittle, who is my dad's grandpa, and he married a woman named Lily Mae Battenfeld, her family was the Mills family, and they had came across the plains in 1859 on a wagon from Kansas to over the pass and down here by Lodi, and then settled up and down the Great Valley here. Different occupations, raising cattle. Some of the uncles worked for, the big ranchers. Say it, Dad. Miller and Lux. There was at that time in the Central Valley, there was a lot of wild cattle running around, and people that were trying to farm and raise crops and stuff had to herd the cattle away from there were no fences, so they had to hire kids and stuff to herd cattle constantly away from their grain crops. And a lot of this stuff is all written down. Our family was really good. Aunt Marilyn's mother, Aunt Ida, which was my dad's aunt, her and her aunts and sisters, they all wrote down all this information that was passed from them. So they have journals and little excerpts here and there that tell us a lot, and so from that you just kind of surmise the other stuff. But so it was Joseph Whittle then that started the cattle. Before that it was mining and a few cows, a few things, whatever they could do to sort of live off the land, Dad's father, Don, began working in the 1920s and earlier than that, really in his teens, for a guy named Herman Cordes, who was a bigger rancher around the area, and would go to the mountains with him, and like Bill said, they would give them animals and stuff. I think he got sheep and things maybe, but I've heard stories like that. But he began doing that and working, and then as he got older, they started putting cattle together. And when he married my grandmother in about 1925, she told me that he borrowed $700 from her that she had made while she worked. She used to be, when she was younger, a waitress and different jobs like that. And she gave him the money to rent a bigger ranch down here that's now covered up with Maloney's, the Gerber Ranch, and kind of got him in that, got started, was able to rent some ground. And over the years, they started going to the mountains. They got a mountain permit up here where Bill Arola is running cattle now, and some of the other families that up here by Beaver Creek and up here on the other side of Big Trees. And they would drive the cattle up every spring with the Arolas, and sometimes in the fall they would all come home together and mix. The cattle would mix, and then they would separate them as they got down here in these lower elevations, and one guy would take his cattle one way and the other one the other, and put them on the winter ranches. So that went on through the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, where my dad and his brother and their cousins, my grandfather always said that his sister Aunt Ida was right there with them all the time, helping. They had a lot of help from family and friends, and like Reggie Osborne, the whole bunch of them. People used to help, and we still do, help each other on the ranches, because there's a lot of work that you can't really pay for. You just help each other out. So currently, since about 1962 or 3, the Whittles decided to take over another range up in the higher country up near Lake Alpine and in the Dardanelles called Pacific Valley Range. And that's when my mom and dad and dad's father, Don and Marie, they left the Beaver Creek Range. They always said it was because they feared fire so much down here. It got so overgrown and so full of brush, and before the timber companies came in there were logging it, that they had the opportunity to go higher, so they did. And that's where we're still running cattle today. My brothers are still running up there, and we have another permit right next to Bill, up by the Clark's Fork off of Highway 108, which we call the Wheats permit. We run a couple hundred cows up there, and on the other permit, they're all permitted a certain number of cows, so we can run that. And it starts in July, 1st of July, and goes on until the 1st of October. And there's a lot of families, not just ours, that are still running cattle up there in the high country. Our cousins are here. I think Kelly's here, the Woosters, which is on my mom's side of the family. They run cattle up above us in Highland Lakes, and they've been running them since the 1940s, when Mom's Uncle Buster and Kelly's dad started taking cattle up there. They also ran cattle down in the lower country down here outside of Arnold, all the way up through Blue Creek and up in the mountain, up in what we call Blue Mountain. So the history continues, and there's a lot of young guys here tonight. See my nephews and boys that work for us, and a lot of Rasmussens. They're all the Arola bunch. All these young people are still actively ranching in the area. There's a lot of cows that are raised here in this county and the surrounding counties. A lot of us lease ground all the way from here to Oakdale and Comanche, and we even go over the pass in the summer. We take a lot of cows and calves over in the Carson Valley area for the summer grazing. So sometimes you see us running around here, you don't really know what's going on, but that's a little bit of it. So I guess if you guys have questions later, there's a lot of stuff out there. We brought some branding irons that we kind of labeled with a little bit of the history on them, and just old pictures that might be of interest to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rex. And Rusty, are you ready, Rusty? I'll stay here long enough to adjust the mic this time.
To answer your question, I guess I'm as ready as I'll ever be. I was a little confused about how I got involved in this. I don't really belong. I am not a native of Calaveras County. I came from the eastern part of the United States. I came here when I was 20 years old. And after the war was over, I met Dick Roleri, and we were married. And then I found out that I was in the middle of a lot of history, local history, a lot of activity. It was interesting. My life has always been very interesting. As to when the Roleri family got involved in cattle, I would say it was probably in the 1880s. Until that time, they lived in Tuolumne County, and in fact, the father had been into some small run for some small part of the county offices there and was defeated, so he gave that up as a hobby. So they leased out, either leased or bought, the ferry at Reynolds Ferry, which is a mile downstream from the Maloney's ferry, Robinson's Ferry. They were living there. They had 13 children. Grandma Roleri bore 13 children. She raised 11 of them, and almost equally divided between boys and girls. But she had a passel of kids. So they operated the ferry for a while. The oldest child was 20 and got married. And I've always thought one of the most interesting stories about that was that they got the license, and then they realized it was in Tuolumne County, and the house was in Calaveras County. So to solve the problem, they loaded everybody on the ferry and rowed out to the middle of the river and had the ceremony and came back to the house for the reception. So evidently they were rather adaptable people. The father died rather suddenly during that time at Reynolds Ferry. I'm not unsure as to what he died of, but he died. Grandma Roleri then looked around for a way to raise her children, and she decided living in town was the only answer. So she leased a boarding house, I guess it was a boarding house or a hotel, on Main Street in Angels Camp, where the present visitor center is located. She decided she needed to put her kids to work. The girls wasn't in trouble. They took care of the rooms and did the cooking, started out doing the cooking and all of that. Everything went along very well. So she decided but business was good. The food was good, so people stayed there. And a lot of people stopped and ate. Meals were 25 cents a piece, as much as you could eat. Homemade raviolis, wine, and dessert. Wasn't terribly expensive. But then, of course, your miners were only making $1 or so a day. She did well, bought the building next door, and expanded her hotel, and needed to have a source of meat. So she decided she would buy some property, since she was doing well. She bought some property and bought cattle and put her boys to work. You take care of the cattle end. Well, then they needed horses to operate the cattle. So then she bought a few mares and a stallion and went into the horse business too. Anything to keep them busy. And even at that, she didn't keep them busy enough. They got into all kinds of devilment. Anyway, she had a great reputation in the county, and if you want to check out her full story, it's available. Very well known in the county. Her son, one of her sons, was also instrumental in the capture of Black Bart. So that was interesting. Anyway, that's how we got in the cattle business, evidently. And that was probably, she bought the property where we live about in the early 1890s, I think. And she bought it because it was wooded. And she needed the wood, and Domingo, her son, agreed to cut the wood and cut it up for usable lengths, and that was used to cooked the meals in the big old wood stove in the hotel kitchen. And I haven't lost it. I'm a little nervous about this. Anyway, the girls operated the hotel, the boys operated the cattle and the horses, and were involved in mischief. The ranch where we lived, this is what I started to tell you, the ranch where we live was purchased probably in the early 1890s, so it's well over 100 years old. So that kind of brings me on a par with some of the rest of these people who were born here. Anyway, it's operated continuously since that time. Domingo bought the ranch from his mother, and he continued to run cattle, ran sheep, some sheep, not a big operation, but some sheep. And then after Grandma Roleri's death, to settle up her estate, evidently they sold off a lot of cattle and a lot of land. She had owned several thousand acres of land too. Her grandson, my father-in-law, Romy, grew up just like the rest of the boys, just not having quite enough stuff to keep him busy probably. Anyway, when they drive the cattle through in the springtime to take them up to the hills, he would be in school and he'd hear the bells as the cattle came up. He jumped out the window and he rode to school anyway, had his horse there handy, and took off. And you might not see him for a week or two, but he joined the drive. His sister was younger than he, and he was a very dominant character. And she learned to ride double behind him, not in a saddle, behind him. And he forbade her to even touch the horse with a hand or him. So she had to learn to ride without being able to hang on to anything. And I've often thought that had to be a heroic thing for a young girl to do. But if she reached out to touch the horse, he'd hit her hand with the quirt. So it was kind of a dog-eat-dog existence, I guess. Anyway, he continued, he went on then and got involved in rodeos, a little of this, anything to make a buck, just a way to make a living. And that was generally what everybody did. They were working at it. And you weren't getting a lot of money on it, but you did live well because you supplied much of your own material. So we still have cattle. We have had all the way along the line from Romy to my husband. Now my son is running the cattle end, and it looks like it's going to continue a while yet. The children were busy today, and sometimes people ask me, does the sound of cows bawling bother you? It's like a lullaby. It's a part of life, and it's a beautiful part of life. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rusty. Now, if anybody has any questions that they'd like to address to any of the speakers here tonight, please stand up and give your name and then ask your questions. Do I see any hands out there? We have one here.
I have to introduce myself. Is that what you're saying? Nate Solomon. Rex was my first student, 5th grade. Right, Rex? Well, anyway, we have celebrities among us, and I want to share something with you about the Whittle family. My wife and I are down at a black and white photo display of Ansel Adams. And if you're not familiar with Ansel Adams, he was probably one of the most famous black and white photographers around. And I'm walking around the building and I'm looking at these photos, and towards the end I come to this one black and white photo on the wall, and I'm looking at it. It said Maloney's, and I said, oh, that's interesting. I read it a little further and it says the Whittle family. Here's Ansel Adams sitting on the porch, and I think it's Donnie's grandparents, and there's a black and white photo of the Whittle family out in Maloney's. I was shocked. I thought, man, this is interesting. And come to find out, it's in one of his books, And unfortunately, I lost the information on the books, and I'm trying to find it, but I'll find it, and it's included in that one book, the black and white photos. So I was really impressed, and I think you should get their autograph.
Thank you. Kathy, did you want to?
In order for us to continue to do this, like the ranchers, the foundation is always trying to get $1. So if you would consider membership or donations or coming to the lectures, we really appreciate the support. And these are being recorded. We are going to be doing more of this, the recording of the local history, so that it's available to future generations. So thank you very much. So if we could have, perhaps Kim, would you like to draw the... So again, thank you everybody. We really enjoyed the presentations, and I think we all learned a lot. So if there are no more questions, I think we're done.